Hi everyone, it's Monica, and welcome back to Tailor-Made Cards for You. Well, today I am joining Craft Room Helpers, and we are going to be sharing with you our favorite craft tools. Now, this is a collab with 8 other YouTube crafters, and we're going to be sharing with you our favorite craft tools that can help you in your craft room. Now, each of us are going to be doing a giveaway on our channels, and all we ask is that you subscribe and leave a comment. Now down below, you're going to find a list of all the people that created a video for this hop. So be sure to check them out after you watch my video. Now my favorite craft tool is this little distresser. Now it's not necessarily the craft tool that I use most often, but it is my favorite. And that's because I can really get a really great effect on my vintage cards. I'm going to be giving away this new one right here to one of my lucky commenters. So don't forget, after the video, you want to go ahead and leave a comment, and I'll be picking a winner after the 23rd. Now the paper that I'm working with today is from a kit in my Etsy shop, and this is my Vintage Office Passport Kit. I went ahead and I printed out my digital images, and then I cut them all out. Now my idea was to create kind of a vintage time slot machine, and I'm going to be using this Sizzix die cut from Holtz. Now for the base of my card, I am using some heavy black cardstock, and that's because I wanted it to be my vintage brown tone on black. I think that's a really classic look, and that's what I was going for, was a vintage look. So using my Tonic guillotine trimmer, I cut down my cardstock. And then I also use my guillotine trimmer to trim down my paper that's in my Etsy shop. Now, like I said, this is digital paper, but I do offer it printed as well. So if you don't have a good high quality printer, don't let that stop you from checking out this kit. The paper that I use to print my images on are really high quality, and the graphics are beautiful. So I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Now, when I use my distresser, there's a special way that I do it because I want to make sure that I don't necessarily tear my paper. Sometimes I am going for the torn look, but I want to kind of show you my technique for using this distresser. Now this tool is designed to fit perfectly between your thumb and your forefinger, and using my opposite hand, I'll hold my cardstock, and then I will put my wrist down on the side that I'm not going to be distressing to hold it straight. I don't want my paper to be flopping around, and you do have to kind of push kind of hard when you're using this distresser. I know that a lot of people that use this don't go in really hard because they're concerned that they're going to be tearing their paper. But remember, you're trying to distress it and make it look old. So you want to go in kind of hard, but not to the point where you're going to be ripping up your paper. You just want to get it jaggedy, and you want to distress it just to fray up those edges. Now, after you fray up the edges, if you do want to tear your paper just to make it a little bit more vintage, you can certainly do that. Or if you want to use the distressing tool to tear it, you can do that as well. But it's a controlled tear. So even though we are distressing our paper and making it look old, it's a controlled design. So just if that makes any sense. So just make sure you have control over your paper, so that way you can control exactly where your frays are going to be and how much tearing and distressing you are adding to your paper. Now this technique does work better with thicker cardstock. If your paper is too thin, then it's going to flop all over the place, and you're not going to be able to hold it steady enough to get a nice frayed look. So your paper does need to be a little bit thicker. And then once I've got the desired look, a lot of times I'll come in with distress ink or even distress crayons, and I'll color up the edges. My favorite go-to color for this is Walnut Stain, but another good one, of course, is your antique, your vintage photo. Those two colors work really well. Now the card that I'm creating for you today is going to have several layers, and I used my distress tool on several of those layers to just fray up the edges. Again, I'm going for a vintage look, so I want my paper to look old, and not only do I want the design to look old, but I want the look and the texture to have that old, worn look as well. And your paper doesn't necessarily have to always go in the same direction. As you're going to see here, I'm going to be working with 3 layers. I've got my bottom layer, which is that ledger. And then my second layer is the cardstock that has all of that layered ephemera. But my third layer, which is actually an invoice, I kind of adhered it off center because I wanted it to look like it was just kind of laying on top and not necessarily positioned perfectly. And on this particular layer, I did curl up and tear some of the edges just to make it look a little bit worn. So once I had my paper layered exactly like I wanted it, then I did get out a couple of stamp sets from Stampers Anonymous. Now the 2 stamp sets that I found worked really well with this design were the Mercantile stamp set and then also the Etc. stamp set. And then for the inside of my card, I did end up using one of the sentiments from Altenew. But I'll make sure that I list the product that I use for my card at the bottom of the video as well. Now, when I'm creating a layered card, I don't necessarily just layer the paper. I also like to use stamp layers, and that's what I'm going to be showing you next. Now, I don't necessarily want the stamp to take over the design. I just want it to complement it. So I thought this ledger stamp might be just a little bit too busy. I think it would be great for a background, so if I didn't already have a piece of paper that was an invoice and had some design already, I may use that for one of my paper layers. But because I already had some paper that looked old and already had some design, I decided to go with some more subtle looking stamps. So this round stamp that I chose to use is from the Etc. stamp set, and the word on it says enclosure. But I really like how the black part of the stamp stands out. And that's really why I chose that. I thought it was a nice contrast to my design. Now, because I am going towards a more vintage inspired look, I did decide to use some brown ink versus the black. The ink that I'm using is from scrapbook.com and it's called Dark Chocolate. And I really like this stamp set that I have. I have about 4 of these colors and I've been really pleased with the results. It is a hybrid ink, so it is a little bit juicy, which is what I like, but it still gives you a nice crisp image. And then there were 2 other stamps that I used from this set. The second stamp that I used was the 15-cent stamp, and that is a favorite of mine. You've seen that on many of my other designs if you've watched some of my other videos. And then, of course, the number stamp is always a great one to put on an edge. Now, the tool that I'm using for my stamping is the Tim Holtz stamping platform, but there's several other stamping platforms out there as well. The Misty is one of them, and I do have that one as well. And then, of course, an acrylic block would work fine as well. Now, if this video was a hop on the tool that I use the most, then probably my stamp platform would be that tool. But again, I'm trying to share with you my favorite tool, not necessarily the tool that I use the most, but this stamping platform is a game changer for me. I use it on almost every single one of my designs, and I'm so happy that it was invented. It really has brought my stamping and my designing to a whole new level. Especially when it comes to those silhouette stamps. That 15-cent stamp may not always be crisp and clear the first time that I stamp it, but because I'm able to stamp it several times in the exact same position, I know I'll always get a nice crisp image. Now, another supply that I often use in my craft room is washi tape. I have to say washi tape is probably one of my favorite types of supplies. There are so many different colors and designs, and it really adds to the interest of your cards. Now, I'm using the set from the Tim Holtz collection, and as you can see, these are the perfect colors for a vintage card. I decided to go ahead and use the washi tape that had numbers on it, since that kind of worked with the overall theme. Now, not only does washi tape add to some interest to your cards, but it also helps to hold down some of those layers. As you see on this particular card, I have several card stock layers, and the washi tape will help to keep those layers intact along with my adhesive. All right, so now that my overall design is complete, I'm going to go ahead and adhere the base of my design to the black cardstock that we cut earlier. And the reason I'm going to go ahead and adhere it before I actually start to finish my design is because I want to make sure that it isn't too bulky. Now, I don't typically have a problem with bulk. I will easily create a design and then add it to my base after the fact, but some of you may have a problem with it being a little bit too bulky and adding it to your cardstock. So that's just something I wanted to show you here. Now, again, the overall idea for this design was to create a vintage time card slot. These are slots that people typically would house their time cards in when they used to use those time punches. And that's the idea that I had. I do have some vintage time cards that I put into my Photoshop, and I shrunk them down and I cleaned them up. Well, I shouldn't say I cleaned them up. I actually made them look a little bit more vintage. And I do have them in my Etsy shop. And that's really what I wanted to use for my design. So this little die cut from Tim Holtz I thought was perfect. It had slots, and I could easily decorate it up to look like a time clock holder. Now, the tape that I'm using to hold down the die cut is that red line tape, and the reason I'm using that is because it is really strong. Whenever I'm creating a design where I know I'll have ephemera being pulled in and out, I try to use really strong adhesive because I don't want the piece that is holding the ephemera to be pulled off of my card. Now, the only thing you have to remember is with this red line tape, it is really strong, and once you get it attached to paper, it's pretty unforgiving. So make sure that you know exactly where you want to put it on your card before you place it down, because if you do want to try to readjust it, you probably will have a hard time and you may end up tearing your paper. So once I had my die cut exactly where I wanted it on my card, it was time to finish the design. And for this, I decided to use some of the Tim Holtz paper dolls and some of the old Idea-Ology that I had in my stash. The paper doll that I found to use for my design was a young man that was in a trench coat, and he looked like he was going to work. And then I found a label that said "Every Day." The label that says "Every Day" was already sticky, so all I needed to do was just trim off some of the edge and then add it to my die cut. And then for my paper doll, I wanted it to pop up just a bit, so I did add some foam tape to the back of that so it would pop up. And then once I had it decorated, it was perfect to add my little time cards. Now, for the sentiment inside, like I said, I did use a stamp set from Altenew, and the sentiment that I ended up choosing stated, "Don't quit your daydream." So hopefully you've enjoyed my design, and I've given you some ideas on how to use that paper distresser. Now, don't forget, you're going to want to leave a comment below to be entered in my drawing to win your own paper distresser. And what I'd like to know is, do you have a favorite craft tool? And if so, what is it? So as always, I'll leave a list of all the products that I've used to create this card along with the links to the stores. Now, if you've enjoyed my video, I would sure appreciate a thumbs up. And don't forget, this is a video hop, so be sure to check out some of the other people that are participating in this hop. Who knows, you may find your next favorite designer. Now, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're like me and you like vintage ephemera to use on some of your paper crafting, be sure to check out my Etsy shop, because I have lots of ephemera that I've created using some of my original vintage forms that I've found in my local antique shops. All right, everybody, thanks so much for stopping by, and we hope to see you again next time.